really interesting bit, I guess, in terms of what the species is, where we found them, the work that we're doing, and sort of likely impacts, and sort of kind of go into the detail of Prussian carp, and while they're an interesting but probably slightly scary species to find in this country. So we'll do that bit first, and then I'll move on to the kind of the regulatory landscape, potential sources, what we're doing about them, and what you can do, particularly as if you're a fishery owner or angling club committee member, that type of thing. So yeah, and as Alex said, yeah, very happy, looking forward to taking questions and providing hopefully good answers at the end. And I'll leave you to judge which one of us is the more expert by the end of the call. But yeah, over to you, Gareth, for the first bit.
Okay, thank you very much. So rather than just jumping straight into Prussian carp or gibble carp, I wanted to give a bit of a background or a bit of an introduction to these fish, why they may be of concern, and some of the difficulties that we're facing. So Prussian carp are part of this Carassius auratus complex, which is made up of 6 species. You can see that there is crucian within this group. Obviously, the status of crucians is in debate somewhat, but the rest of them are non-native to the UK. There is one of the species within this group, Carassius auratus, is obviously the goldfish, which we also have here in England. But up until recently, none of the other Carassius species have been detected. The one in greyed out there is keen eye will note that there's actually 7 names there. There is a further subspecies. There is debate around its identity as a true species yet, but as currently it is classified as a subspecies of goldfish. So this whole complex, all of these species are predominantly from Asia and Eastern Europe, but where they have found themselves in other countries, they have formed invasive populations, and obviously we know about the potential threats here from goldfish and their ability to colonize waters, and understandably, being a fairly ornamental variety, goldfish are one of the most widely distributed fish from this complex. So more specifically now into Prussian carp. Prussian carp or gibble carp, as they're sometimes called, or even silver crucians. Now they've got quite an interest in biology. They're highly tolerant of poor environmental conditions, so low oxygen levels, low DOs, and just generally poor and degraded environments. And this quote, when I've been doing some work investigating these species, sort of describes them quite aptly, and it's from a quote from William Yarrell, saying, "This fish is exceedingly tenacious of life. I've known them to recover and survive, having been kept out of the water for 30 hours. So you can see that they are quite a hardy species. Alongside that, they've got a very broad and an omnivorous diet. So they're not confined to a small niche or a small, food items. They're able to make use of all of the food or the resources within a water body. Interestingly, some of you may have heard of triploid rainbow trout. When we introduce rainbow trout, and even for food production, we tend to prefer the triploid versions, in the fact that they're sterile, and obviously within the food market they're not devoting resources into gonad production, so it all goes into body weight. But the Prussian carp or gibble carp can introduce in, say, the normal, if you will, diploid, but also tetraploid, and even hexaploid, octoploid, and decaploid. So there's many ploidy forms of these species, and it's quite an interesting trait, really. One of the fascinating things is that invasive populations have been dominated by females almost exclusively. And it's only after a post-invasion, after a number of years, do you start to see the males coming through, which is, again, quite a unique trait. But perhaps the most fascinating thing that well, the most fascinating aspect of these fish is their method of reproduction. So they can reproduce through the sort of normal means, if you will, of a male and a female, you know, and obviously releasing eggs and sperm, and then you've got combining of the genetic material and resulting progeny. So Prussian carp are actually can actually reproduce using the sperm from other cyprinids. So in this instance, we've got a carp, but it can be roach or bream, for example. And the sperm is actually used to it's not used to fertilize the egg. It's almost, it starts the initiation, so starts the egg development. So it's not actually the genetic material within the sperm is not being incorporated into the egg. It's essentially pressing like a go button and starting the process, and that's all it's used for. So the result from that is that you get the egg development, and obviously the hatching and the fry, and what the end result of that is identical clones. So identical clones of the female. So this will explain why some of the invasive populations are exclusively female dominated, because they don't need males to establish these populations. So it's very unique, and I think it's only shared by one other species of fish. So it's and this process alone, let alone their hardiness, you know, their ability to make use of all the resources, you know, with this broad omnivorous diet, it makes them quite the successful invader. And this is why we have concerns about them. So to be an invasive species, you've got to do more than establish populations and persist. You have to go on and cause impacts. And some of the impacts that have been noted, you know, we're still undertaking work here in England to see what is going on and what are their impacts on our freshwater fisheries and fauna. But up until now, we're having to rely on impacts that have been noted elsewhere in their invaded range, so across Europe. So they've increased water turbidity, like general benthic feeders have, you know, will have that ability to increase the water turbidity through their feeding mechanisms, and as a result, they'll end up modifying the ecosystem, so pushing out native species. That coupled with, you know, some of the traits that we highlighted earlier, leads them to become the dominant species in a system. So obviously, if you've got a dominant species, so a large biomass and large numbers of one species, and those species are able to make use of all of the resources, you can guess that there's going to lead to the impact on native fish species, and in fact that's what's been noted in Europe. Perhaps as a consolation, there's been no sort of evidence of extirpation, so total loss of native species, but that is only because perhaps we haven't detected that yet. And one of the things of concern, obviously, with the Crucians here in England, is the ability for this genetic integration with other Crassia species. So the hybridization, and obviously that can have a significant impact on Crucians. As I said, you know, they have the ability to undergo this gynogenetic, this reproduction using, you know, creating clones, but they can also reproduce with the sort of in the more traditional means and lead into hybridization. So that's just some of the impacts that have been detected in Europe. So on to the story so far. So what has happened in England? So around 2019, we noted references to sort of Carasio in fisheries, and upon investigating this, it didn't take much searching to find that Carasio is actually a term used on the continent to describe some of the fish that are captured within matches, and which are indeed Prussian carp. So we undertook investigations, and we highlighted a couple of waters that we wish to obtain some samples from. So in December 2020, we managed to obtain some fish from a fishery in the northwest, and shortly after confirmed the identification as being Prussian carp. So the first record of this species, first confirmed record of this species in England. So fast forward to current state of play. So far, we've confirmed the presence in 7 sites, and we have 17 more sites which we suspect to contain these non-native species, and obviously be wishing to obtain samples from these to confirm whether they are or not. Excuse me. So as part of our work, undertaking these, bringing in the samples and going through and identifying them, we've actually detected 2 other non-native Carassius species. As part of these investigations, I will sort of expand on that a little further, just once we've gone through a bit more about Prussian carp. So identification. Okay, so first, I know there's a lot of anglers here and fishery owners and people that are just general interested in freshwater fish species. So if we look at this picture here, this is in fact a Prussian carp. Arguably, at a glance, it would appear to be a carp hybrid. It's very, very similar looking to some of the potentially the F1s that we may be seeing, or just the natural hybridization that from a carp and a goldfish. So they're quite a tricky one to speciate out, and this is part of the problem that we faced. I'm often asked to identify fish species when people find sort of odd or interesting or non-native species. They'll send an image to myself, and we can confirm it. And obviously, something like a topmouth gudgeon, even on the grainiest, lowest megapixel camera image, we can still pretty confidently say straight off the bat that is a topmouth gudgeon. These, on the other hand, require much more in-depth analysis to confirm the identification. And you can see from the image here that all these lines all over the fish here, this is part of the process that we undertake when we obtain these fish, is that they are photoed so that we can obtain some measurements. And there's in excess of 30 or even 40 measurements on these fish that we are taking to try and establish some of the key ID features. So that's essentially the first step. There's a couple of features that we also look out for. You'll note on these fish particularly that it's not a unique trait, but the Prussian carp will have the very dark pupil and a real silver highlight around that pupil, that halo. Now, unfortunately, as I said, it's not a unique trait, so even just the presence of this doesn't sort of confirm it as being Prussian carp. So we have to look at other features. You can see the mouth here, and what you will notice is the absence of barbules, even microbarbules. They'll be absent. So in F1 hybrids, the crosses that are produced, they may have very, very reduced barbers, even down to tiny nubs. But if you look closely on a Prussian carp, they will be totally absent. Unfortunately, again, this trait is not exclusive to Prussian carp. Goldfish will have an absence of barbules, so it's not a unique separator in itself. So then we rely on some of more sort of traditional fish taxonomy, where we're looking at meristics. So meristics is the counting of data, or counting of features, really. So we'll undertake probably the most basic is the lateral line count, and this involves obviously counting all of the pawed scales along the lateral line of the fish, and again, you will see there's a common theme running through here, is that the number of lateral line scales on a Prussian carp, there's generally a range reported for these fish. It lies within the ranges of other species, namely goldfish. So again, nothing really as yet to separate it out and confirm the species. We'll undertake a full counts and analysis of the fin rays, so the fin rays and spines from these fish. Here you can see the spines and the branched rays on the anal fin from this fish. Can't really make out too clearly, but where they've got the needle there holding the fin, the first ray is quite highly serrated, as is the first the major dorsal spine there. They're very, very serrated, which I'm sure amongst the anglers among you will know that carp and goldfish and potentially F1s also share this feature. So again, we haven't really, we are, if the fish has all of these features, we are sort of heading in the right direction on confirming the ID, but we're not, we can't put a confirmation on it as yet because they are shared amongst others. So next step is that we will dissect the fish. So when we open the fish up, the first thing that I look for is this black coloring of the peritoneum, so the body cavity is black, and that is a fairly distinct feature among the Carassius. Again, unfortunately, goldfish also have this. And you can also see just in the top right of the picture, there's some ovaries. So these fish were sampled in the winter, so I think. So you can see there's a reduction in the ovaries, but nonetheless, there's still eggs developing there. Okay, so we're working our way through this fish now. We've undertaken a load of morphological measurements and morphological analysis, meristic, so the counts or the fin ray counts. Perhaps one of the key features that we look at is the number of gill rakers, so the white bits on this gill, on the first gill arch from this fish. Again, there is a range of values reported, but one of the key features here is that once the number of gill rakers exceeds the range reported for goldfish, then we're able to confirm that it is gibel carp. Gibel carp will have a range of a number which ranges, I think it was 46 to potentially 53, and goldfish only really go up to 47, 48. So by counting these number of gill rakers, once we hit that 50, it's a pretty strong indication, combined with all the other features, that we are looking at Prussian carp and not goldfish. But given the sensitivities, and obviously there's regulatory implications here, what we have to do is obtain the genetic material from these fish and sequence them. So we will take a tissue sample, we will obtain the sequence and therefore the barcode, and we will compare this to published barcodes for various species. This is international database, and see where our fish species or the fish in question matches. So essentially, there's a number of models that will run, and they will look at the barcode, compare them to all the other hundreds of thousands of barcodes that they have got on that database, and it will essentially pick out the ones that it more closely matches and gives you a percentage score with that. So this is how how much work is having to go into confirming these individuals. Okay, so the distribution so far, you see from this heat map, widespread throughout England, but in isolated populations. You can see, with it being a heat map, where you've got the yellow indications there is a little cluster of sites at these locations. But you can see it is literally from the top to the bottom of England. None detected. Obviously, we're working with partners, so NRW and the Scots on this. So none have been detected in England, in Wales or Scotland to date. Obviously, our partners are aware, and they'll be collaborating with us, and we've led on the identification of these fish. So it's likely that if there is a suspected population, that we will be confirming or otherwise the ID. So this may all be fairly new up until recently. So early in May, there's an initiative run by the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat called Invasives Week, and we actually launched some promo material, or some communications around the Prussian carp and its discoveries, and that led to the sort of BBC film crew would come into the lab and run in a story, which was brilliant because it got the message out there. And this is where we're sort of asking for some help, because whilst we have these number of sites where we suspect them to be, we don't know where they all are yet. And it's critical, and Andy will go on to explain why we need to know where these fish are. But yeah, we welcome reports, even suspicion of, obviously, as I said, we've gone through the issues of identification here. I'd rather see reports that may not be gibel carp, but we can fairly rapidly establish whether we would wish to see a sample or not. So I would welcome reports, and there will be some contact details to follow. Yes, so that'll be at the end of the presentation there. Sorry. Okay, so aside from Prussian carp, I mentioned that there was 2 other Carassius species present, or that we detected, Carassius langdorfi and this subspecies, if you will, the Carassius auratus grandoculus, so Gimbuna and Nigerobuna. Again, not previously recorded in the UK. So just in the last couple of years, we've detected 3 new fish species, which again were not recorded, confirmed being present in England or even GB. So it's some pretty exciting work, but also concerning. And Andy will cover some of that shortly. As I said, that they're part of this Carassius auratus complex, and you can see why it's becoming a complex scenario, and why I'm including Carassius auratus grandoculus here, even though it's deemed to be a subspecies currently, because it was only up until 2012 that Prussian carp were actually separated out as a unique species. Up until 2012, they were considered to be a subspecies of goldfish. So this is quite a change in picture, and it's a very complex issue. And the Carassius auratus complex is a name that is pretty well deserved. So again, you look at the features of these fish; they're very hard to distinguish between one another. There, obviously, there's the one on the left, the Carassius langdorfi is looking in a much poor state. That arrived to me dead already, unfortunately. So the images are not the best, but you can see that they look pretty similar to one another. But we're having to rely on molecular analysis again, and this diagram here is. I don't want to get bogged down with the details, but you can see that how all of these species are connected, and each of those lines at 90 degrees to the main lines is effectively a genetic mutation. So the more of those lines that are going at 90 degrees, that gives you an idea of how far removed a species is from another one. So we can see in the top right corner there, you've got Cyprinus carpi, obviously carp, very separate and distinct from your Crucians. You go further down the diagram there, and you can see that, going back to what I said about gibel carp and Prussian carp, rather, being very closely resembling goldfish, and you can see why, because they've got this overlap and they're so closely related to one another, but still genetically distinct enough to be considered a species in their own right. And then you've got Kaveri, which we haven't detected yet, or hopefully never will. But up in the top left corner there, you've got this Carassius langdorfi and the grandoculus. And you can see that they are very similar to one another genetically and morphologically. So there is a bit of work that we're still having to do to ensure that we're as robust with identification as possible. But what we can say is that the 2 new species that we found are not goldfish, they're not Prussian carp or crucians. They belong to this group up here. So, but we have nonetheless speciated them out. So you can see it's quite a complex issue that we're facing. So some of the work that we're looking to do now, or we have been undertaking rather, is next generation sequencing. Now it sounds pretty fancy techniques, and it's like, well, is that just blue sky science? You know, why are you looking at that? It's used to sequence entire genomes. You know, so all of the genetic material within a species. We looking at that, you know, may sound like, as I said, you know, purely academic, let's say. But what this does is that we're able to look at the nuclear, so the genetic material within the nucleus and of the mitochondrial genomes. This is important because up until all of the data that I was explaining to you now, where we take it off for genetic sequencing, a lot of the genetic sequencing is reliant on mitochondrial genomic information data. So that all comes from the mother. So if you are looking, usually saying something like I don't know, Wells catfish, if you establish that the maternal, so the material coming obtained from the mother's side of the genes is Wells catfish, then it's enough along with some of the features to confirm that that is a Wells catfish. When you're considering this Carassius auratus complex and the subtle, very subtle, slight changes between the species that we're looking at, we are not 100%, or it's difficult to be 100% that whilst you can tell that the mother was a Prussian carp, doesn't necessarily mean that the paternal, so the father side of the genetic material was a Prussian. So we're using this next generation sequencing to look at all of the genetic material that's available within these fish. And what that allows us to do is to establish whether the species that we're looking at are true 100% Prussian carp, or whether we're dealing with Prussian carp crossed with a goldfish or other crosses. And obviously that then goes on to inform some of the management and also how perhaps these fish are entering the UK. But perhaps most importantly out of this is by obtaining the genome of Prussian carp, we're able to design a primer. So it's a section of DNA that we're looking at the whole genome, and the genomes for goldfish and say carp are published already. And what we can do is we can look at those genomes and all of the material, the genetic information there, and look for unique codes that are exclusive to Prussian carp. And in using those unique, you know, this unique codes, those base pairs that you might have heard of, we can then design a primer and use that for our eDNA monitoring. So that there is fairly critical. You need to be able to, you know, if you're undertaking environmental DNA analysis, sampling water, and then you put it through, you know, you obtain all the barcodes from it and sequence that material, that'll essentially tell you what species are present within a water body. But you have to know what you are looking for, and as part of that, we want to ensure that if we get a positive from an eDNA sample for gibel carp, is that it truly is a gibel carp and that we haven't just picked up some goldfish material. So this is why it's important that we undertake this this next generation sequencing. So that's a bit of a sort of brief intro. I hope it was useful, at least, into Prussian carp and the Carassius auratus complex. And now my colleague Andy is going to take over.
Thank you, Gareth. So yeah, as Gareth alluded to, a pretty complex species, coming from a further bigger complex of species, and to continue the theme, I guess, a fairly complex regulatory status or landscape, I guess you could call it, that covers them. So yeah, as with all non-native species in this country, there's a range of different regulations that they would fall under, depending where they're being moved to, where they're coming in, and what's happening. So just wanted to give you a bit of insight to those and who's responsible for them, because I'll come on to talk about sort of the work that we're doing and others are doing on these in a bit, and that's very much driven by the regulations that each of us have responsibility for. So the top three on that sort of the picture: aquatic animal health, locally absent species, and prohibition of keeping of release of live fish, all governed by Fish Health Inspectorate, and they really control the types of species that you can legally bring into the country and then keep or rear within either ornamental or aquarium trade, or within sort of aquaculture production businesses, as they're termed. So sort of think, aquaculture fish suppliers either supplying into aquaria or into restocking industry for fisheries, so fish farms and the like. So yeah, all three of those regulations are covered by the Fish Health Inspectorate. Imported fish into the UK, obviously also covered by UK Border Force, and the Fish Health Inspectorate work very closely with them for fish being imported into the country, whether that's for food or for restocking purposes. But all of those regulations sort of cover the bringing in of Prussian carp and others into this country, and then keeping them within those type of facilities. Once those fish are potentially then moved into the wild, we, Environment Agency, cover keeping and introduction of fish regulations. So you would need a permit both to introduce these fish and to keep them in inland waters in the UK. Also England and Wales, so and natural resources Wales will cover that regulation for Wales. We cover it for the whole of England. So yeah, both a permit to introduce and keep is required, and alongside of that, Natural England cover the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which, as a non-native species, these fish fall under as well. So range of different regulatory bodies involved with different sort of steps of the process, depending on the type of facility they're being held in, or whether they're being introduced or being found, I should say, probably more accurately, in the wild, and obviously at the starting point of bringing into the country in the first place. So yeah, next slide, Gareth. Thank you. So yeah, so with that in mind, moving on to sort of some of the work we're doing and ourselves and Fish Health Inspectorate, as to how these are coming into the country and what the potential sources of these fish have been or might still be, and that's still very much a question that we don't have the answer to. So at the moment, we know Prussian carp are being imported into the country for food. So those are fish that are coming into one of the main ports in a lorry, taking to typically Billingsgate Fish Market in London, where they're being then sold into the food market. So moving on to either direct into restaurants or onto another supplier to go into the food market. Has been some issues with that, so and this goes very much back to the hardiness of these species that Gareth talked about earlier. So Fish Health Inspectorate regularly undertake inspections at Billingsgate Fish Markets, have found Prussian carp there. To comply with the legislation, they should be eviscerated when they come into the country, so absolutely dead and no chance of coming back to life. But they're finding fish and have found fish on ice in Billingsgate, uneviscerated. You can put those in a bucket, and they have done, and a good proportion of them will reanimate themselves and basically come back to life. And we're probably talking fish that have been on ice for 36, 48, even 72 hours from when they were removed from where they've been farmed within Europe. So yeah, really hardy species, and potential for that as a source, but probably not the most likely. Fish health inspector, I'll have been working with those traders that are bringing those fish in to make sure that evisceration part of the regulations is complied with, and continue those inspections and continue working with UK Border Force to make sure fish that are legally being brought in are compliant with the regulations in terms of their kind of effectively being very dead status, rather than just being brought in on ice. So again, as Gareth talked about, the difficulty in identifying these fish, could easily mean and quite possibly mean that they've been brought in to the country mixed up with a batch of goldfish. Goldfish being brought in perfectly legally into the aquarium ornamental trade. Prussian carp and the other two species being brought in with those as sort of misidentification, and then potentially ending up in waters in the wild as a result of that. Again, quite possibly that's a route, but not wholly certain that that's the sole source of these. And given that we're finding these in fisheries and in numbers that undertake sort of regular stockings, then it is perhaps more likely that they've come in through aquaculture production. So either intentionally bought or unintentionally bought, and again misidentified, and being introduced into fisheries, or either direct from the continent or mixed up in batches of fish that are within fish health production facilities in this country. All of those again, regulated by the FHI, and they've been working with a range of suppliers to understand their movements of fish, and checking those sites to make sure those fish are what they're supposed to be. And again, what we don't know is whether, again, this is a historic introduction. So, we have no fresh source of these fish coming into the country, and what we're seeing is as a result of a past misidentification or whatever it might be happening, or whether we've still got a sort of a live source coming in and being regularly distributed, and that's something we're very much working on at the moment. The final one is transfer between waters, so where they have been stocked out into the wild into a fishery, and then that water being netted to reduce stock levels and those fish being sold on. Again, possibility. The difficulty of identifying these fish could mean that could easily happen. Again, assumption that this might be a carp hybrid, might be a goldfish. When people are looking at them, not really understanding that there's something different. Really easy to do, and then inadvertently transferring them around is definitely a risk, and definitely something we're very alive to. So yeah, range of potential sources. No, as I said, no definitive answers, but something that we're working pretty actively on, particularly with the fish health inspectorate, to get to the bottom of that and understand what we're dealing with. So next slide, please, Gareth. So I just want to move on to now sort of the controls and work we've done to date. So as we've talked about, understanding where these fish are, the range of sites they're in, the numbers of sites we're talking about, and what they're doing within these sites, is key when we're building a sort of a management regime for any non-native species. So yeah, building that picture of distribution is absolutely critical. As part of that, raising awareness of the fishery community, so talks like such as this. We've got an ID guide now, very kindly, on the Angling Trust website. That QR code will take you straight through to it. Also repeated at the end of the presentation. So if you're not quick enough with your phones, then there'll be another opportunity to snap that now later on. So yeah, raising that awareness with angling clubs, fishery owners, anglers themselves, so we can continue to build that big picture distribution. That very much key first step. Reporting restrictions of fisheries. So as soon as we have a suspected site, then we are very much restricting movements of fish off that site from the get-go. Once that presence is confirmed for any of these species, then we would look to contain them on site, so bring them into compliance with the keeping of fish regulations that we control, so they'll be placed on the keeping part of the permit. not the introducing part, but the keeping part. So again, no further introductions would be permitted, but would be compliant with keeping those fish on their site, and that enables us to bring in controls, things like screening, to minimise the risk of those fish escaping from the site, and we will continue to restrict movements of fish off the site. Again, very much focused on the difficulties of IDing them. These fish are not like topmouth gudgeon. You can't just assume you could put a net round and go, well, these fish are clearly Prussian carp, and the rest aren't, and therefore the rest aren't that are safe to move. We'll just put the Prussian carp back. We'll do something else with them. That difficulty IDing means the risk of moving those fish inadvertently to another water is very real, and one we're very aware of. At this point, we're not undertaking environmentally led or required eradication program or removal of fish from the sites that we know they're in. We've done that with topmouth gudgeon, obviously, undertaking eradication program, but we're very much in that kind of probably quite a bad phrase, but sort of discovery phase around Prussian carp and exactly where they are and what risks they pose. And we want to absolutely find that out before we move forward and change our regulatory approach from the one we have at the moment. And crucially, work really closely with a range of government agencies, largely within the DEFRA group. So people like CFAS, Natural England, Non-Native Species Secretariat, to make them aware of what we're finding, get their agreement with how we're managing them within the wild, work with Fish Health Inspectorate, obviously, on their remit, and keeping Minister informed. So Lord Benyon heads a monthly biosecurity meeting and is fully aware of these species and the risks they pose and the work we're doing to understand them, build that picture of distribution and what we might do next. So moving on to that, next slide, Gareth. Thank you. So as Gareth talked about, so that refining our approach to identification is kind of one of our key next steps. So as you can imagine, IDing these fish in a lab using that traditional approach of taking measurements, counting scales, looking at body morphology, dissection, etc., takes time. And when a sample of fish comes in, it takes a good few hours, if not a day or so, to process. Ultimately, we're always having to rely, for all the suspected samples that Gareth's seen, we're always having to rely on molecular approach to date, so that DNA sequencing of that particular fish. So given that's the case, we're now solely using molecular and keeping the samples in case we need them. That speeds up sort of the whole process for Gareth at the lab, or certainly the resources required to ID these fish. So we've moved to that to save Gareth time and so he can devote it to other things. And also with that next generation sequencing, we're exploring this year how we can move to using eDNA to further understand that distribution. So something we're trialing with topmouth gudgeon at the moment is around sampling water in locations around ponds, in lakes or rivers that are connected to them or that they flow into, to understand that spread, and that's something we want to move to with Prussian carp as well. And that next generation sequencing will allow us to do that, so we can sample in the surrounding environment, water environment, where we know these fish to be, and see if we can understand whether they are further spread in that area, or use our regular water quality monitoring networks to understand that spread further in the country, for areas that we're unclear on, or whether we're in areas where we're getting suspected sightings but haven't been able to get sort of confirm actual specimens to confirm ID. We're also doing further work with Fish Health Inspectorate as to likely the sources of these fish, trying to narrow it down. A lot of that, and the image to the side there is no accident. A lot of that is trawling through stocking records from fisheries and from fish suppliers, working with fisheries to understand what's coming to the country and when. We have some additional resource within our National Enforcement Service now, specifically focused on fisheries work, not just working on this, covering a range of different things, but this is one of the areas that they'll be picking up to try and get as far down as we can to seeing where these fish might be coming from. And again, crucially, whether this has been something that's happened in 3, 5, 6 years, 10 years in the past, or whether it's something that is still happening. And all of this sort of continue to understand distribution and the impact that these fish are having, what they're having on the continent, what they're like to have in this country, will inform our approach going forward. So whether we stay with our current sort of policy of containment within sites, or whether we change that to active removal or eradication program, will be absolutely informed by our understanding of where they are and the impact that they're having. So just final slide for me, and the next one. Thanks, Gareth. So yeah, just really wrapping up. Really some things that you can do to protect yourselves from getting these fish. And it really is about being a smart fish buyer. Is when you buy anything, do your homework into who you're buying for. But absolutely, if something's not something you expect it to be when it turns up, then don't accept it. And I think for buying fish, that's absolutely critical. Probably can't stress that highly enough. If those fish are not what you expect, they don't look quite right, you are the customer. It is absolutely your right to say that you don't want those fish. If they don't arrive in good condition, then that should be the supplier that should be you're getting those fish from, is providing fish that you're expecting and in a good condition. If they're not, then that's their problem to sort out. Don't make it your problem by putting them in your water, because once they're in, as I'm sure you'll know better than me, it's very hard to difficult to get them out, or almost impossible, particularly with difficulties in ID, and they very well may not be alone. So the picture of the Argylis species there, that's Argylis mongolianus, the first new Argylis species we've seen in this country, recently appeared in fisheries in a number of different places. Has a bit of a different modus operandi to the native Argylis species that we have over here, and potentially even more of a threat to native fish stocks than our native Argylis species are. Seems to very much target the gill areas rather than just focusing on the whole body. That species has come in with a stocking of fish, almost undoubtedly. Whether that was Prussian carp or something else, we don't know, but that's almost undoubtedly come in with a stocking of fish. And again, once it's in your fishery, you'll never get rid of it. Where you get your fish from, using trusted suppliers, making sure they are what you expect them to be is absolutely critical. If someone offers you fish on the cheap, or whatever that might be, don't be tempted to take those, and certainly be very cautious, or don't tempt to source fish at all through ornamental or aquarium routes, because the risk of bringing in different pathogen species, different diseases with those is even higher. So hopefully some useful messages there for those of you who are fishery owners or angling club representatives. Buying fish is you're in control. Make sure you are in control when you're buying fish, and at the stocking be present. And if you're not sure about something, then question it, and if really not sure, then don't accept those fish. That's it from me. Just move on to the last slide, which has got information on that QR code to the ID guide for Prussian carp and their friends, as we're calling them, for the other two species. It's held on the Angling Trust and on Native Species page. As we said, we'll get these slides out to you as a PDF in the next week or so. So you'll have those links like that. And as Gareth said, really keen, absolutely our understanding of where these fish are at the moment in this country has very much come from anglers and fishery owners saying, I'm not quite sure about this, don't think it's what I think it is, do you know what this is, sending those reports to us. You can either do that through our instant helpline, or even better, send those images and reports to Gareth through the non-natives email address that's there on the screen, and we'll get in touch and let you know what we think they are, or whether we need to get a sample of those fish. So yeah, thank you for listening. I hope you found that useful and informative. I think yeah, time for questions and answers.